Hello everybody, Petro here. I've been getting a lot of questions. I want to do a few more polished videos than what I've been doing on Facebook Live. And one of the big questions I've been getting is sulfur. Customers are asking, do I need sulfur? How much sulfur do I need? Is it crop specific? Is it field specific? So what I want to do is go into the sulfur cycle. We'll talk about how to identify if you need sulfur, and then we'll go through some sources of sulfur, and I'll let the real sleuthing and recommendations go down to a conversation between you and your fertilizer retailer. So let's get started. We'll go through our sources of sulfur, and when we look at our sulfur cycle, the source that everybody is talking about is acid rain. So a long time ago, we used a lot of coal power. There's a lot of industrial processes. The byproduct was sulfuric acid. That would go up the smokestack out into the atmosphere. It would get deposited down onto our ground. We basically got free sulfur. Now, with the Clean Air Act, that has changed. We used to be getting tens of pounds of sulfur per year per acre. That number, depending on where you're at, depending on the year, all those sorts of things, it comes down to about 5 pounds. Now, is that 5 pounds useful and available to the crop? Probably not. It's going to fall all year long. It comes down in the form of H2SO4, and that sulfate, so that SO4 2 negative, that is what the plant takes up. So it's pretty readily available. When we talk about losses, there is a good potential to lose that, especially if there's not a crop growing. So we may not be getting this full 5 pounds. When we think about other sources of sulfur, the main one we really need to concentrate on is that organic matter component of the soil. So I've got a pretty crude drawing here. You can see we have some crop residue. That residue breaks down over time into organic matter. There's organic matter already in the soil, and that is one of our main sources. So there's a bunch of numbers I've read. I'll put all my sources up a little bit later in the video, but they toss around numbers like 100, 140 pounds of sulfur per percent organic matter. So if you've got a 5% organic matter soil, there may be 500 pounds of sulfur available. I've seen other total numbers that just estimate how much sulfur is available in soil organic matter. They range 200 to 400 pounds. So a lot of numbers, but the big thing to remember is not all this is available right away. It's tied up in organic forms, kind of like our nitrogen is in soil. So that organic matter needs to break down, and you get the slow trickle effect of sulfur. So if we've got a cool, wet growing season, you go out, you plant early, there may not be a whole bunch of sulfur available, but as things warm up, as those soils warm, those microbes get more active, you're going to see more sulfur coming into the soil. Now, I'm not going to give an estimate of how much of this happens every year because it does vary. We will talk about how this relates to needing sulfur in a few minutes. So we've got a couple other sources. I keep saying we'll talk about it in a few minutes. The other one is what we apply in fertilizer. There's quite a few sources of sulfur fertilizer. We'll talk about those. The other one, fancy drawing here, I think it's a donkey. I don't quite know what I was trying to draw, but manure can be a good source of sulfur. It's like organic matter in the soil. It's an organic form. So when you look at things like poultry or swine manure, there could be 3 pounds per ton of sulfur. Now, of those 3 pounds, that first year after application, you're going to get about half. So per ton, there could be about 1.5 pounds per ton available that next year. If you're looking at dairy manure or beef manure, it's about half. So you're looking at 0.75 pounds that first year after application per ton. Now, that's going to vary widely depending on what manure you're using, what those animals were fed. So you really need to test that manure, or if you're having manure applied by a broker or somebody else, make sure that they're giving you a good analysis so you know what your sulfur is going to look like from that manure. So we've got organic matter putting it into the soil, we've got crop residue breaking down, eventually putting it into the soil, we're applying manure, applying fertilizer, we're getting some free from the sky but not as much. So we need to talk about loss. So the sulfur that the plant is after, I said, is in the sulfate form, and that's got a net negative charge. And if we think about our soils in Ohio and Indiana, our soils mostly have a net negative charge also. So when we think about a negative and a negative, if you remember from grade school science, if you put two negatives together on a magnet, they're going to repel each other. So this is going to be similar to nitrogen in the nitrate form, where we have a pretty good risk of loss. It's going to move with that soil water out. Now I said our soils have a net negative charge, so there are some positive bonds that they could latch onto and hold on to. And we also have all of our cations. So things like calcium that have a positive charge in the soil, they're going to bond to that negative charge in the soil. And there may be, depending on the cation, some bond left to hold on to that sulfur. So one thing we see is with that cation exchange capacity, there's an increased chance that we will hold on to more sulfur the greater that cation exchange capacity is. So when we look at our chance to get sulfur, our chance to lose sulfur, there's really some soils we can start honing in on. And if we've got a low organic matter, we're not going to have enough sulfur supplied to us. If we've got a low CEC, we're going to have an increased risk of loss. So some numbers I've come up with, and these are just Petro's thoughts. You'll see ranges from 1% organic matter up to 3% organic matter. CEC ranges can get pretty low. But the research that I've done, a lot of the work that I've seen, is if you're falling below 2% organic matter, or if you are lower than a 15 on your CEC on your soils, that's where you start to run into sulfur deficiency. And that's where the research is really pointing that as you get below these levels, that's where sulfur fertilizer is needed. So we can use that to try to sleuth out our soils and figure out where we need that fertilizer. Because one thing that we hear about often is huge increases from sulfur fertilizer. So 8 bushel per acre because you applied sulfur. The research I've done, you can see that, but it's limited on where you're going to see that. So if we look at our typical field, I'm going to draw a topographical map, and it's a really crappy topographical map, but just bear with me. So here's our high points. Here's our low point. If we go out, I don't care if you zone sample, if you grid sample, it really depends on the field and what you're trying to accomplish. But I would look at these, and I'm going to sample my high points. I'm going to sample these zones that are kind of in between, so our slope, and then I'm going to sample our low spots and get those results back. And let's say we come up with our high spots are averaging 1.5% organic matter, and our low spot, let's say we're at 5% organic matter. In this scenario, we're going to see up here, we're probably going to be low on the amount of sulfur we can supply. And if our intermediate is coming in at like 2.5, it may or may not respond to sulfur. But we'll know that this low area, if we've got 5% organic matter, we're probably not going to see a response to sulfur. So in this scenario, we're basically going to try to identify these hilltops, maybe these intermediate zones, and that's where we're going to apply the sulfur fertilizer. We're not going to apply it down here where we don't need it. So variable rate is going to be key on applying sulfur. And if you're going to just broadcast a whole field, you'll see an increase up here. You likely won't see a return on your investment, so it's probably going to turn out to be a wash. And that's what I see with a lot of the research we do when we're looking at a field scale trial, is we don't necessarily see a positive return on investment. But what we do see is these lower areas that have lower organic matter tend to bring up the yield. We don't really see a response where the organic matter is above 2%. One more quick scenario. I live up in Northwest Ohio, and we are blessed with some very large fields of one soil type of Hoytville clay. And that Hoytville clay is typically 4.4% organic matter, about 16 for a CEC, and I just can't get a positive response for sulfur. So we've got enough here to supply our soils. We've got enough here to hold on to that sulfur in our soils. So in these scenarios where you've got a whole field that's just above those critical thresholds, there's really no reason to apply sulfur. Every once in a while you'll get a hit. So if you get some cool wet conditions, the roots can't grow, we don't get enough release out of that organic matter, you may get a hit. But year over year, we tend not to see an economic response there. So I'm going to fast forward real quick and write out some charts. So there's going to be a jump in the video, but just bear with me.